help me welcome our guest today, Dr. Duane Gill from the Department of Sociology at OSU. Duane?
Thank you.
We got lots of fun swag today. We'll have some announcements later, but please make sure if you have to leave early, I know this is a very informal event, it's come and go and so forth. Make sure you take yourself a OSU Research on Tap coaster with you. And if you have any great research ideas throughout the evening, you've got a place to jot them down on the back of the OSU Research Matters napkins, because many good research ideas wind up first on the back of a napkin, and we recognize that. So thank you for being here today. This is January's edition of OSU Research on Tap, and we're welcoming Dr. Duane Gill from the Department of Sociology at OSU. Now, you know, the title of today's conversation is "This Research Project is a Disaster," and we kind of threw that out there, figuring that would catch just about anybody who's ever been a part of any research project in any discipline whatsoever, because at some point every research project feels like a disaster. But you really study disasters.
Right.
Now, it's a concept we're all familiar with, but from your perspective as a disaster sociologist, how do you even define a disaster as distinct from just something that, you know, something bad happens? Bad stuff happens all the time. What makes a disaster?
Sure. Well, the idea of a disaster is still evolving. I mean, there's lots of debates. And so from the sociology perspective, for a social science perspective, what makes an event a disaster is really the impact that it has on communities and people. Okay, so when we look at a disaster, we're looking at it first and foremost from how does it affect the social structure of a community or area, how does it affect the social processes that go on, the kinds of interactions that go on. And so when an event occurs that disrupts the social processes, that disrupts the social structure to the extent that the community is no longer able to function the way that it normally does, and they need to call in some help from outside, that's what makes an event a disaster.
So a really bad car wreck, for example, it's horrible for the people who are involved.
Right.
No one would think that's a great thing, but the city, the community can kind of still keep on being the same city and community it was before.
Right, and it's got the resources to help those people who are suffering from a really bad car wreck or other accident. So it doesn't disable those kinds of social support help that goes into effect. But a disaster kind of disables a lot of these social support, so you don't have that coming in and helping. And that, again, distinguishes something from an emergency or a really bad accident or something other bad happening. It's what it does to the community, to the broader social structures and processes.
Well, I thought I would kind of launch into the specific topic for us today by just reviewing a couple of basic facts. So on March 24th, 1989, the Exxon Valdez, an oil tanker owned by the Exxon Shipping Company, bound for Long Beach, California, struck Prince William Sound's Bligh Reef at 12:04 a.m. local time and spilled 10.8 million U.S. gallons of crude oil over the next few days. Now, within a very short time, you and your team were on site conducting research. Mm-hmm. Where exactly did you go and why, and how were you able to get there so fast after that?
Right, so back in the day, back in 1989, the University of Colorado Natural Hazards Center had a program called the Quick Response Program. So basically what they did is they had a pot of money that they got from a National Science Foundation grant, and they would, at that time, solicit proposals that would study some aspect of a disaster. Now, the Quick Response Program offers basically just enough money to get into the field, not to do a whole lot of
So it's in
about $4,000.
$3 million research.
No, about $4,000.
Okay, about $4,000.
About $4,000. So we basically had a proposal written to try to look at a technological disaster, and we were just kind of waiting around for...
Technological, so a disaster that had some kind of
human cause that was the main trigger of the event, as opposed to an earthquake or a flood or a hurricane, kind of more natural causes or triggers. This is something, an oil spill is a tanker. So it's technology that failed, or the humans operating the technology failed. And this was the case in the Exxon Valdez. Captain Hazelwood was inebriated when they got on the tanker right after they, Actually, he wasn't drinking beer. He was.
I suspect he was drinking something a little.
He was drinking something a little more
beer,
solid. Yeah, vodka tonics, I believe, was his choice. But
we're not driving a tanker right now.
No, and I'm not driving home either. So, but the thing about Captain Hazelwood, he had lost his driver's license in the state of New York for drunken driving. And
but it
so
kept his tanker license
Exxon
in
knew
place?
that he had an alcohol problem, but they had failed to supervise him and check on him. And so you have a fully loaded tanker and a fully loaded captain. And actually the captain...
Bad combination.
It gets worse because the captain went down to his quarters as they were leaving the Valdez Narrows and had made a course change to avoid icebergs coming off the Columbia Glacier up in Alaska. And he left it to his third mate to make the correction back into the shipping lane. And the third mate failed for whatever reason to make that correction, so they ran into Bligh Reef.
Ran aground. Right.
Bligh Reef was discovered by Captain Bligh, the English captain
Hence
of
the
the
name.
Mutiny of the Bounty fame. And so it's not like it just suddenly appeared. It's been there in nautical history for a long, long time.
Documented. Yeah.
Right. But when he hit that reef, or when the tanker hit the reef, the officials say almost 11 million gallons. The locals will tell you it's about 3 times that much.
So the number I read, 10.8 million, is the official
Exxon
version.
would be very happy with you repeating that as often as possible.
That's the version that they allow to be on Wikipedia.
Right.
I'm pretty sure. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So where exactly did you go? You didn't
So
just
I went
go
to the
up
community
to the edge
of
the
Cordova, Alaska.
Cordova. Okay.
And it's an interesting community. It's a commercial fishing community. So about all of its economic and social and cultural activities revolve around fishing, primarily commercial fishing, but there's subsistence fishing there as well. There's a very significant indigenous population. But to give you an idea of how important commercial fishing was for Cordova, prior to the oil spill in the 1980s, it ranked consistently in the top 10 of commercial fishing ports in terms of revenues generated.
Top 10 in
Top 10 of the United States.
Okay.
I think in the mid-90s, after the oil spill, it had dropped down into the 50s.
Wow.
So there's like 50 ports that were more profitable than Cordova. So that's the kind of drop that happened. And again, that's the impact of the oil spill. It wasn't that it hit the shores of Cordova.
But the specific fish they were relying upon.
Right.
What
the fishing grounds,
particular,
primarily salmon, and there's 4 different major species of salmon that are fished commercially, kings, reds, pinks, and silvers. But also the commercial herring fishery, that was one that was most heavily impacted. And that's one that I think has caused the greatest amount of changes in the community and probably contributed to a lot of the psychosocial stress that we observed in the community in the years afterwards.
So you weren't just looking for, hey, did this cost people livelihoods? And so you were looking a little deeper than that. So what were you looking for, and what did you generally find in this research?
Yeah, so more generally, we're just looking at what does this technological disaster do to a community? And this is a somewhat unique community because so much of its existence was based upon the resources that were damaged by the spill, the fishing resources and other kinds of natural resources. So it takes a while for these natural resources to recover from the oil contamination and toxicity. And we really didn't know, in terms of the physical science, all of the ways in which oil can affect the physiological development of fish. And so that's a whole different line of science that as a social scientist I don't know very much about, but I know that it's important to understand some of those fundamentals in terms of how then does this affect the interaction of people and their environment and resources.
So obviously very disrupted and cut off a lot, but what in terms of, when you and I talked a bit beforehand, I can guess some of the effects something like this would happen. What did you learn through your research that would be maybe a little beyond what we might just
Sure. Well,
armchair
a very kind of, in retrospect, obvious thing that came out is those people who are most tightly tied to the resources that were damaged experienced the greatest disruption and the greatest amount of psychosocial stress.
Psychosocial stress. Now, I'm a psychologist, so I kind of know exactly what you mean. But
Right.
Unpack that for us a little bit. Psychosocial stress.
So the measure that we used was the impact of event scale. And this is kind of a standard psychological scale. And it measures kind of intrusive thoughts. So you keep having thoughts that intrude your thinking, and it's about the oil spill or some aspect of the spill. For example, you might be continuing to have these pictures of some dead oiled otter or some bird or some devastation keep popping into your mind. So that's an intrusive component. Then there's an avoidance component. You avoid talking about it, you avoid reminders of it, and it's the avoidance thing that really gets into a lot of the social, because if you're going to avoid people who are going to bring up the topic that you don't want to talk about, well, then you're not interacting the way you used to.
You're starting to avoid a lot of people in Cordova,
You're starting to
Alaska.
avoid a lot of people. You're starting to avoid family members.
Yeah.
So I know there's some family members today who do not speak well of each other or to each other because of actions taken right after the oil spill. So it's these kinds of intrusive thoughts and avoidance behaviors that kind of permeate at the individual level, but it has a collective effect. So if you have like 50% of your population engaged in avoidance, then you've got some interaction issues in your community. They're not working the way that they're normative too.
Yeah. So if I'm remembering right, this way of measuring the impact of something, you're not diagnosing post-traumatic stress, but that scale is kind of related to the more impact an event has, the more likely someone is kind of operating in a post-traumatic state.
Right. As a matter of fact, it's kind of a proxy for PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, and so there were other social psychological components too. For example, we found a loss of self-efficacy. People didn't feel like they had as much control over things in their life, and that they were able to do things to improve the situation. So you have this kind of loss of self-efficacy.
So just that starts to sound like they became a bit hopeless. Like nothing I can do is going to help anything.
Pretty much, and it's hard to do anything to fix the natural environment. It's going to kind of heal on its own. And then the legal situation comes into play in events, particularly technological disaster events, where there's an identifiable party to blame. There's a responsible party. So Exxon was the responsible party. Yeah,
because this isn't quote, what is it they call it?
It's not Hurricane Harvey.
It's not an act of God, as they say. This is
an act of human beings or human agency involved, and so you get litigation coming into play instead of the Red Cross or the Stafford Act and FEMA coming in to the rescue. You don't have that situation coming in after a technological event as opposed to a natural hazard event.
I want to come back to litigation in a minute, but so you guys went up there, to introduce this, but you were on the scene How quickly? How many days after were you?
We were actually in the community about 5 months afterwards.
So
we did a lot of
just a few months,
groundwork
you were up there.
in between the event and
Yeah.
actually getting into Cordova.
And that first wave of being up there, interviewing people and so forth, that lasted about how long?
We were there about 10 days.
Okay.
So my colleague Steve Piku and I did some household surveys. So we went, divided the community up into different neighborhoods and randomly sampled within those neighborhoods. It went different ways. Most of the time we would just sit down and read through the survey and mark the answers with the respondent. That seemed to work the best because some of these questions kind of elicited some emotional.
Yeah, because this is not just, you're not asking me what I feel about Tide versus Era detergent. You're talking about my livelihood.
You're talking about your livelihood and
my
your
home
families.
and my family.
Right.
Yeah.
So I remember interviewing a woman and I was going through the impact of event items, it was about 15 items, and about halfway through, she just kind of, you could see that it dawned on her that she was in trouble psychologically. You know, she had a lot of psychological problems, and part of it was she had 4 sons.
So to say it out loud kind of changed it a little bit.
She had 4 sons who were of age to go into the commercial fishing business, and she didn't know whether that was going to even be the future life style or economic prospect for them. So it's not only her life, but her sons and their families that she saw as being jeopardized by this event.
So I want to come back to litigation in a minute, but so you went up there for these 10 days, you gathered a bunch of data, and I know you did some things with those, including, you know, understanding the things you've been talking about. But then what came next? You didn't just, okay, that was fun, we went to Cordova. This became an ongoing kind of project for you.
Well, we kind of, as we were finishing up in Cordova, you know, we recognized that from the literature that technological disasters tend to kind of drag on a lot longer than natural disasters. A lot of it is the litigation, part of it is the recovery of the natural environment. You know, you can rebuild the built environment.
Right. So a tornado, as horrible as that is, you can rebuild.
Right. But it's hard to harder to get rid of the contamination. It's harder to restore this species of fish that were decimated by this spill. So, and you can't physically do anything like that where you can physically rebuild.
Right.
You know, so that comes into play as well.
Just bringing resources to it doesn't fix it.
Right. Right.
So you went back several times?
We went back. So we said, you know, there's a long-term study here, and one of the things that we observed was that people in Cordova, a lot of people were just still 5-6 months after the spill, rushing around, you know, kind of a frantic pace. And we pointed out to them that, you know, this is not a 100-meter dash. This is a marathon. And you guys are running this marathon like it's a 100-meter dash, and you're going to run out of steam. So we started giving some advice. We also had an opportunity to do kind of a field experiment. So we found a community that was similar to Cordova in size and economic reliance on the fisheries. It wasn't, I mean, every community in Alaska had some kind of tie to this region, but most of the commercial fishermen didn't fish in the area, so it was a relatively good comparison. So what we basically did is the same survey with a random sample of people in our control community, Petersburg, and then comparison of the two communities, Cordova was significantly higher on these measures of psychosocial stress. And so we wanted to get this information back to the community so that they could begin to better assess the kind of mental health issues that they might be facing and try to be better at mitigating some of these stressors.
So you mentioned litigation. So there were lawsuits that went on for a long, long time. And this was all during the time when you were going back and studying the community. So can you talk a little bit about how that process, that litigation process, both while it was ongoing and then when it finally wrapped up, how that impacted the community?
Well, the litigation went on for 19 years.
Oh, gosh.
Right, so I don't know if you've been involved in any kind of litigation. It's stressful.
It's stressful if it happens for like 3 days, let alone 19
Yeah,
years.
let alone 19 years. So really, I think you can think of our research in 3 phases. The first phase, from 1989 through 1992, we were basically collecting data on how this event was impacting the community. And we clearly showed that commercial fishermen and Alaska Natives, the 2 groups that had the most close ties to the resources, were significantly more stressed than the rest of the community. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we focused on that. And our data then, we published some publications out of it. And the plaintiffs' attorneys, the fishermen and other plaintiffs' attorneys, began to cite our work as evidence that there was harm to the community in the litigation, and that somehow this should be compensated. And this then wound up dragging us into the litigation because through the process of discovery, which is a legal process where each team,
Gets their
each
evidence
side
on
gets
the
to know
table.
what the cards the other guy is holding. And so the process of discovery, Exxon demanded our data and all the names of the people that we had talked to.
Lord.
And so we wound up into a court battle just to protect our human
Protect the
subjects.
privacy of the people that
Right.
participated. Yeah.
And so a lot of this went through the University of South Alabama, where my colleague Steve Piku was located. And so that was kind of the first phase. So as we got drug into the litigation, we kind of became expert witnesses for the plaintiffs, and then we began to develop some alternative mental health programs for the community as well. So there was a 1994 jury trial, and in that jury trial, Exxon was found guilty and negligent. And so I think there was about $500 million in actual damages and $5 billion in punitive damages that was awarded by this jury in federal district court in Alaska. Exxon appealed the punitive damage assessment, and this appeal went back and forth between federal district
So that was
court.
the 19 years of...
Yeah, and so finally, I think it was 2008, the Supreme Court of the United States agreed to hear the case. And then they basically decided that instead of they reduced the punitive damages award down to basically a 1-to-1 ratio. So that
Same as
actual
the
damages, punitive damages cannot exceed the actual damages, which is not punitive at all in my opinion, but that's the ruling that the Supreme Court came out with. So they began to disperse the money in 2009, about 20 years after. And so I think all the money, for the most part, was distributed by the end of 2009. So the third part of our study was to try to understand what impact the litigation settlement was going to have on the communities. If they got $5 billion, not all of it would go into Cordova because there's plaintiffs all over the country, but that would be a big bunch of money coming into a very small community, about 2,500 people. So what's that going to do? Or if they get nothing, and these people who've been waiting for 20 years, I heard people that, well, I'm going to go out and shoot something. I'm going to go out and sabotage the pipeline. I'm going to, so we heard all kinds of potential violence toward others, toward pipelines, toward themselves. So we wanted to be in a position to say, okay, one way or the other, we're going to study the impact of this litigation settlement. And that project went on from 2000 to 2013. Just collect data before the settlement and then collect data after the settlement.
So you learned a lot about Cordova.
Yeah.
But this, and the specifics of this, but did you learn anything that's been sort of applied outward into disaster contexts well beyond the Exxon Valdez?
Yeah, I think probably what I would say is kind of a signature product that came out of this was during the phase where we were doing kind of an applied project in an alternative mental health program we developed for Cordova. Part of that was something we called a peer listener program.
Peer listener program.
So just kind of informal leaders in the community, the police, the teachers, others who kind of interact with the public. We basically trained them on how to listen to people who had issues, primarily about the Exxon Valdez, but it could be other things. Not listening in a judgmental way, but in a way to help kind of, okay, you need to let off some steam. I'm a person you can let some steam off with.
You need to be heard.
And if I think you need some extra help, I'm going to try to figure out a way to get you some
To help you get there.
some professional help. Right, so they've kind of screeners, but not doing the diagnosis or the treatment themselves, but being able to refer and help people if they wanted to. The problem with Cordova was there's so much stigma associated with mental health problems and seeking out help that the people did not want. And you go to the local hospital, you take a left for medical services, you take a right for mental health services. In a town of 2,500, everybody knows within a day whether you took a left or a right. Yeah. So people were avoiding seeking out help. So it's this alternative mental health program, the peer listener program, that was exported widely after the BP Deepwater Horizon spill.
So it's been used in the Gulf and.
Right.
Yeah. Gotcha.
I think the other thing that came out of our research, we showed that after time, being involved in litigation became more stressful than the event itself, than the oil spill itself. Okay, so the longer this litigation drug out, the more the psychological, social stress drug out. Okay, so BP and the plaintiffs' attorneys down on the Gulf Coast knew about our work. And I think it inspired them or encouraged them to avoid
to just
repeating
get to a settlement.
Kind of Let's get to a settlement, cut our losses, and move on. So instead of 20 years of litigation, most of the litigation in the BP Deepwater, I think, was finished within 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
I think there's still some outstanding cases, but the bulk of it is done. And so you've basically eliminated 12 to 15 years of added stress from ongoing litigation. So I feel pretty good about the work that we did, inspiring or encouraging a quicker settlement in that situation.
We're going to get to audience Q&A here in a minute. Before we do that, I've never been in one of your classes at OSU, but I know 1 or 2 people in here have been, and I wonder if you really crack a whip, because my gosh, what an attentive, still, quiet audience we've had today. And I want to remind everybody that this is the Iron Monk Tap Room. You don't have to be quiet. You don't have to sit still. You can go get another beer when you want one. So we're not really going to take a break. We're going to get to Q&A here. Now I'm going to make a couple announcements. But as I'm making these announcements, I want people to feel free to go grab another beer. In fact, maybe if my wife or Ron or somebody would, oh, she's got me one. Look at this. All right. Even bring me another one. That would be awesome.
I'm drinking amber, by the way, if any of my students who want to graduate would.
Just a few announcements before we get back to one last question and then Q&A. At OSU, in addition, kind of a sister program to the OSU Research on Tap is the Science Cafe program that we have at OSU. The next Science Cafe, as it turns out by accident, is tomorrow night. So if you're interested in heading up to the Edmund Lowe Library in the Peggy Helmick browsing room, Dr. Bailey Norwood from the OSU Department of Agricultural Economics will be discussing research on GMOs. I know that's a very hot topic in the world right now. I want that we have little flyers around there next to your swag that's on the table about the OSU Research app. If you are an iPhone user, you can go download that right now. If you're an Android user, sometime in the next 24 hours, the actual thing will be there. It's completed. It's been released. It's been approved. It just takes a while for it to to migrate onto the Play Store. That's why you should take your little thing to remind yourself that sometime between now and tomorrow night, check there. And there's a developmental, like a beta version that's there now, but there should be a new one there. So that's going to be your ticket to staying up with all things OSU research. You can also, of course, follow OSU Research on Facebook and Twitter and all that fun stuff. A few Iron Monk announcements. Wednesday nights here at Iron Monk are trivia night, and those start at 7 p.m. An Iron Monk OSU connectivity, in addition to OSU Research on Tap. The OSU Creative Writers Association periodically does a Prose, Poetry, and Pints event here at Iron Monk. I've been to one of those. They're fantastic. The next one is January 29th at 8 p.m. They're a lot of fun. You ought to come out. And then one that I'm going to try to make it to, I shouldn't even announce it because the last one was so crowded they had to turn people away. So I'm going to get in. Whether you get in or not, I don't know. But on February the 3rd, the Laugh Tap comedy show is going to be here at Iron Monk. And our next Research on Tap, we normally do these the third Monday of every month. Because the third Monday this month was a holiday, we chose to put it off to today, the fourth Monday. But our next one is on February 19th, and we'll circle back around to that. So, Duane, one last question. Mm-hmm. This work has obviously impacted the people of Cordova. It's impacted the whole field of disaster sociology. But how has this impacted you?
Wow. Let me count the ways. I think maybe the most obvious is it's been kind of a signature piece of research for me. So it's helped in my promotion from assistant to associate to full.
So it's kept you here at OSU.
It's kept me lots of
along,
publications and research money coming in. So it's helped develop my professional career. But I think it's had lots of different effects. So for one thing, it's really hard for me to fathom how these events can continuously unfold. We never seem to learn that fossil fuels are not necessarily the way we want to sustain our future. And the more that we rely upon them, the more these accidents occur, the more it convinces me as an individual citizen that we need to do something better. We need to do something different. It's given me all kinds of experiences that I can bring into the classroom, as several of my students can relate to. Whether I'm teaching disaster sociology, environmental sociology, research methods, social theory, I'm able to bring in experiences from this research that makes what's written in the book, whatever book I'm using, seem more real and more salient. So I've been there, I've done the research, I've got the T-shirt, so it's given me that kind of credibility that I can bring into the classroom, that experience that I can bring into the classroom. And then it's had some very personal impacts. There are people in Cordova that I continue to maintain friendships with. I'm not a big Facebook user. I think I have about 300 friends and acquaintances and family members, some of which I didn't have. I'm sure we all have that.
You can unfollow them.
Yeah, I know, but relatives, you have to face them once in a while. But about 30 of those 300 are from Cordova.
Wow.
And I recently got married in Cordova on the 21st of July to my spouse, Liesl Ritchie, who's in the audience here.
Married in Cordova?
Married in Cordova. So that's how special the place became for me. And Liesl, she did some work starting in 2000 on the Exxon Valdez. So it is a really, really special place. It's Alaska, when I first arrived there, is such an incredible difference from the lower 48. And just the different shades of gray. We were there in August when there was like 4 or 5 hours of darkness.
Yeah.
So it's like 20, 21 hours of daylight, just learning. Oh, thanks.
Looking a little dry.
Yeah, I am a lot dry.
Told you this was informal, didn't I tell you?
So, it's become a very special place, just personally, outside of all the research. And it is kind of hard, I will have to admit, to go to this place that I love so much and the people that I respect and like so much, and know that for some people, when they see me in the community, it reminds them of the bad stuff that's happened. But I think since the litigation has been resolved and all the payments is out, I think the community has kind of been able to put this event behind them, put it in kind of an historical context of other disasters and calamities.
So it's part of their lives, but
it's
it
part
doesn't
of their
define
history
lives.
now.
Yeah.
It no longer defines the community the way that it did 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Well, I've kind of been hogging you here, so I'm gonna stop now. We're gonna open up for questions. We have a new toy today. So our microphone for the audience is this fun little ball that Amy is carrying here. And so she's tossing the ball around, and it actually has a little sensor in it that when it's being tossed around, it doesn't work. So if you talk with your hands, stop while you're asking a question, and it'll actually work as a microphone. But who would like to ask Dr. Gill a question?
Well, this is a pretty simple question. You were at OSU when this started, right?
No, I was actually at Mississippi State University in 1989, and so I didn't get to OSU until 2009.
So this was a collaboration from where you were at Mississippi State with colleagues at South Alabama, right? Dr. McKeever.
Duane, I could see you through the glass. A comment really, but I'd be really interested in your observations. The Exxon Valdez disaster was one in which the environment was damaged. Physically, chemically, biologically, it was really damaged. The Fukushima disaster some years ago, where the radiation was released, there was no damage to the plant life, to the animal life, or to human life from the radiation release. But there was a lot of damage to all of those, especially human life, caused by the evacuation. Mm-hmm. And as a result, the other consequences, the psychological consequences, the sociological, the financial, they were all huge. So it just struck me that we have two disasters here, one which was real in the sense that there was real damage done, and one that wasn't real in the sense that there wasn't real damage done. And I'm not talking about the tsunami, I'm talking just about the radiation release. And yet the final consequences were very similar, and litigation is ongoing. So that's the observation. I'd be fascinated to hear any comment you might have.
Sure. So the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident was really part of what we call a NAWTEC disaster. So there was a natural event, the tsunami, which basically created the nuclear accident. So it wasn't as much of negligence on the part of an individual or agency like we had in the Exxon Valdez, although one could argue they should have been better prepared and had better mitigation to keep the tsunami from inundating the area. But it does have, I think, some similar impacts in terms of how it not only affects the psychosocial, but also the social structure of the area. And I think the social structure impact for Japan is at a country level where they've scaled back and begun to shut down their nuclear program. So that is a significant change in the society and the economy and the lives of Japanese people, particularly in that area. You don't have quite the same nationwide impact with the Exxon Valdez.
That kind of circles back to our opening conversation about the, bad stuff happens, but our readiness for it and our reaction to it kind of helps define whether or not it becomes disastrous.
Right,
in
right.
a sense. So a 1,000-year rain could happen, but if our floodplains are developed and our plans are such that we don't destroy crops, homes, or have loss of life, it was just a bad rainstorm. Whereas if that preparation is not there, it's a devastating
disaster,
flood that's a
right.
disaster. Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So,
Good catch.
so I'm thinking about the people who live in this town, and there's a whole lot of money that comes flooding into it. It's a little bit like winning the lottery. And then you've got other people next door who didn't get any at all. Did you take a look at that, and how'd that work out?
So in Cordova, because the punitive damages were so puny, that really didn't have the kinds of divisiveness that we were anticipating. If it would have been the full $5 billion punitive damages that were paid out. So I think that really softened the kinds of divisiveness that you might have between the haves and the have-nots. And after a while, everybody was just let's just get it over with. We don't care how it turns out. Let's just be done with it. So that, again, kind of smooths over those differences between the haves and the have-nots. Now, there's a little bit, but not to the extent that we had anticipated had the full amount been awarded.
Would have been a very different scenario with a $5 billion
Yes.
punitive settlement.
Or a zero.
Or a zero. Yep. Interesting.
We weren't anticipating the middle road.
Yeah.
Talk about a disaster. We had, it's either going to be this or going to be that. No, it's something in
So
between.
this was a disaster for the researchers
Right.
and their publications that they were planning.
We weren't able to do what we had set out to do.
Other questions?
When the main source of income was cut off, how did they survive?
Yeah, a lot of them didn't survive very well. There's lots of bankruptcies. Lots of people left the community. The biggest loss was the herring fishery, which the herring collapsed in 1993, 92, 93, and they haven't had a commercial herring fishery since. And commercial herring before the oil spill accounted for about 1/3 of the economy. Okay, so one of the effects that you see is in '89, the year-round population was about 2,500. Now it's about 1,800. So you've had a decline in the demographic population. You have a lot of people putting more resources into other kinds of fishing, more into salmon and so forth to get away from the herring. But you really have not, that community has not recovered that economic loss even today. And there's really not any real firm prospects for that commercial herring season to come back. So yeah, you've lost 1/3 of the income of a community, 1/3 of its economy. It's hard to replace that, and they have not been able to do it.
Another question?
Thank you, Dr. Gill. I wanted to ask, what kind of threats did you face tangling with a huge corporations that had quite a name for itself?
Oh, so you're talking about the threats of Exxon as opposed to
Retaliation.
bears
Yeah.
and moose and things like that we might have.
Yeah, I'd much rather tangle with a bear than with Exxon. Exxon, again, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest threat was when they came after our data and were trying to get the names of our participants. And so we went to federal district court in Mobile, Alabama, to basically find a way to protect our human subjects. And we were relatively successful, but it was a very stressful experience. What made it more stressful was one of our subjects had committed suicide and had talked about the Exxon Valdez as part of the contributing troubles for him that led to the suicide. And the prospect of our data getting out and being misused to lead someone to even contemplate suicide, let alone carry it out, that was a really, really heavy burden to carry. And we were prepared to go to jail and be in contempt of court if we did not protect our human subjects. And at the same time, there was another sociologist who was actually in contempt of court for not answering a court order on another topic, not related to the oil spill, but these kinds of things were going on at the same time in the early 90s. And, so to think about, spending part of your academic career in jail in contempt of court was not, but at the same time, protecting human subjects was much more important than what I would experience if in that. Luckily, we was able to get that settled in a way that was, I think, satisfactory for everybody involved. But that was a really, really difficult time, and I felt maybe not so much threat from Exxon, Exxon attorneys, but the whole system was. It did not smell very good, if you will.
So Duane, during this part, the litigation and the possibility of, contempt of court, so what was your academic rank? Because I think that would, I would think differently if I was an untenured assistant professor. Also,
that was me. I was an untenured assistant professor.
Did you have graduate students also? So, think about the psychological effect on you and your graduate students.
Right.
Does this have an impact? Does this?
Most of the graduate students that I was working with, they were not involved with the Exxon Valdez research, so they were doing other kinds of projects for their dissertations and theses.
But you were very vulnerable as a young assistant professor, right?
Did you feel you had the support of the university?
Okay,
But
so
he was at Southern Miss. So
I had Mississippi State.
Mississippi State. Sorry.
Mississippi State.
Sorry.
So I had the support of my research center director. I had the support of my department head. I felt like the dean of was supportive. Where I did not receive any support was from university council. I received a subpoena in 1994 to turn over everything. And this is after the federal district court case down in South Alabama, or in Mobile, where we basically protected our human subjects. But as we got closer to litigation, Exxon wanted more information. And the university attorney at Mississippi State asked me how quickly I could arrange to have it all to turn over to them. So at that point, I hired my own attorney and took her advice. But the university council is looking after the university; it's not looking after me.
Well, and I don't know who the vice president for research was at Mississippi State then. The vice president for research at Mississippi State now is an Oklahoma State grad, so I think he would have been in your corner if he'd been there.
Yeah.
Well, I know this is not about one-upmanship, but the first federal lawsuit I was involved with, I was still a graduate student. I didn't wait until I was Well, thank you so much. We got one more question. We're going to finish with a question from Dr. Ray Hunke, and then we're going to...
Hey, Duane, I really appreciate your comments. Curious, any big project that I'm involved in, I go through the process of what lessons did I learn and how can I apply that next time? Mm-hmm. Any major ones that come to mind?
Yeah, so one of the things that we actually employed in the latter part of our work was we got a certificate of confidentiality.
Yes, that's important.
From
National Institute of Health, I believe. some of the issues.
Yeah. So basically, what that does is it protects your human subject. It gives another layer of protection for your human subjects. That if you're collecting data that's very sensitive with mental health issues and other sensitive information, this provides a layer of protection from outside entities trying to get that data. So that would have been another layer of protection against Exxon getting the names of and data on our respondents. So that's one very practical thing. The other one is be more strategic in what you plan to do, and where it might lead.
We were being quite reactive in
right.
regards to this because it was so emergent.
Yeah, and a lot of disaster research is kind of reactive, particularly when you're responding to a particular event. Now, there's disaster research that helps community become more resilient. You don't need to have an event in order to have that kind of research unfold, but the kind of response after an event kind of research, I think has made me think a little bit more clearly about what it is that we need to know and how to collect it in a way that maybe diminishes some of the hardship or stress on the participants. Although many of our participants find it very therapeutic to engage in the research, the longitudinal part gets kind of tedious after a while. There were some people that we interviewed or surveyed maybe 8 times over from 1989 through 2000.
So they're the ones that have unfriended you on Facebook.
Or never friended me to begin with, yeah.
Well, we can continue these conversations. There's nothing that's kicking us out the door, but I do want to respect everyone's time and wrap things up. So would you help me thank Dr. Duane Gill for his conversation this evening? So our next research on tap is going to be right here in the Iron Monk, February 19th. We'll be back on our 3rd Monday of the month schedule. And we will be featuring Dr. Terrell Conway, who's here with us this evening. And he's going to, I think the main topic is E. coli and friends. So we talked about
There's a disaster for you.
all of Duane's friends on Facebook. Apparently E. coli has a Facebook page and has a lot of friends. So we're going to be talking about E. coli and friends. You won't want to miss that. We have a traditional speaker gift that we use, which is our OSU Research on Tap medallion that comes complete with the bottle opener. That's right there. I'd like to present that to you. So please join us back here a few weeks from now. But until then, a toast. May your intellect be meritorious and your impact be broad.
Thank you.
Hear, hear.